My name is Dr. Rebecca Walsh, and I am a theoretical physicist who worked for NASA's Advanced Propulsion Laboratory until 2021. What I am about to tell you will sound impossible, but I have documentation, photographs, and physical evidence that proves every word is true. On March 15th, 2019, I became the first human being to accidentally travel through time. Due to a catastrophic malfunction in an experimental quantum drive system, I was transported 26 years into the future, spending 72 hours in the year 2045 before being pulled back to the present. What I witnessed in that future timeline has haunted me for 4 years. I've been bound by classification levels that officially don't exist, threatened with imprisonment, and watched as 2 of my colleagues died under suspicious circumstances to keep this secret. But 2045 is only 21 years away now, and the events I witnessed are already beginning to unfold exactly as I saw them. Humanity deserves to know what's coming, because we might still have time to change it. In 2018, NASA's Advanced Propulsion Laboratory began development of what we called the Alcubierre-Chen drive, a theoretical faster-than-light propulsion system based on manipulating space-time geometry. The concept was simple in theory. Instead of accelerating a spacecraft through space, we would compress space-time in front of the vessel and expand it behind, effectively allowing the ship to ride a wave of distorted space-time at velocities exceeding light speed. I was the lead theoretical physicist on the project, working with a team of 12 researchers to solve the massive energy requirements and exotic matter problems that had made the Alcubierre drive purely theoretical for decades. By early 2019, we had built a small-scale prototype, not large enough for human travel, but capable of demonstrating the basic principles of space-time manipulation. The test chamber was about the size of a refrigerator, surrounded by electromagnetic field generators and exotic matter containment systems. Our initial tests were promising. We successfully created measurable space-time distortions, proving that the theoretical framework was sound. The energy requirements were still enormous, but we had demonstrated that controlled space-time manipulation was possible with current technology. The accident happened during our 15th test run, when we attempted to push the system to its maximum theoretical output. On March 15th, 2019, at 14:23 Eastern Standard Time, we initiated what was supposed to be our most ambitious test yet. We had calculated that maximum power output might create a space-time distortion visible to our external senses, proof that we were on the right track toward a full-scale propulsion system. I was in the control room monitoring the quantum field fluctuations when Dr. Michael Torres, our chief engineer, reported anomalous readings from the exotic matter containment system. The field strength was climbing beyond our projected parameters, but all safety systems showed green. At 14:24:17, the containment field destabilized. Instead of the controlled space-time compression we had planned, the system created what I can only describe as a temporal fissure, a tear in the fabric of space-time itself. The emergency shutdown failed. The field generators overloaded, and the expanding space-time distortion engulfed the entire laboratory, including the control room where I was standing. The sensation of being caught in a temporal displacement field is impossible to describe adequately. It feels like being stretched across infinite distance while being compressed into a single point. Every atom in your body exists in multiple times simultaneously until reality snaps back into focus. When the distortion collapsed, I was no longer in 2019. I found myself standing in what had been our laboratory, but everything was different. The building was abandoned, partially collapsed, with vegetation growing through cracks in the walls. Sunlight streamed through holes in the roof, and the air had a strange, acrid quality that burned my throat. My first thought was that I had been unconscious, and the facility had been damaged in the accident. But when I checked my phone, which somehow still worked, the date display showed March 17th, 2045. I had traveled 26 years into the future. The outside world confirmed what my phone was telling me. The NASA facility was located in what had been a thriving research campus in 2019. But in 2045, it was part of a largely abandoned industrial zone on the outskirts of what the locals called New Houston Sector 7. The city I emerged into was unlike anything I had seen in my timeline. Houston in 2045 was a vertical metropolis of towering arcologies and enclosed atmospheric systems. The sky was a permanent gray-brown haze, and most people wore breathing masks when they ventured outside the sealed buildings. But most shocking was the social structure. This wasn't the Houston I knew. It was a divided city where the majority of the population lived in underground or heavily shielded structures, while a small elite occupied the towering spires that pierced through the toxic atmosphere. Over my 3 days in 2045, I learned what had happened to the world I knew. Climate change had accelerated far beyond even the worst-case scenarios we had been discussing in 2019. The global average temperature had risen by 4.2 degrees Celsius. The polar ice caps were gone. Sea levels had risen by nearly 3 meters, flooding coastal cities and displacing over 1 billion people. But the heat and flooding weren't the worst of it. The real catastrophe was atmospheric. A cascade of feedback loops had triggered massive releases of methane from melting permafrost and ocean floor deposits. The atmosphere had become toxic in many regions, requiring sealed habitation systems for human survival. Agriculture had largely moved underground or into sealed atmospheric domes. Most of the world's forests were gone, either from wildfires, droughts, or deliberate clearing for emergency food production that ultimately failed. The global population in 2045 was approximately 3.2 billion, less than half of what it had been in 2019. The reduction wasn't primarily from climate disasters, though those had claimed hundreds of millions of lives. The bigger factor was the resource wars. Between 2031 and 2043, humanity had fought the most devastating conflicts in our species' history. Not over territory or ideology, but over the basic resources needed for survival. Fresh water, arable land, and rare earth elements needed for the atmospheric processing systems that kept people alive. The wars had begun as regional conflicts over water rights and agricultural areas, but had escalated when the global economy collapsed in 2035. Traditional nation-states had fragmented into city-states and corporate territories, each controlling whatever resources they could secure and defend. Nuclear weapons had been used 3 times. Once in the conflict over the Sahara Solar Array in 2038, once during the Antarctic Water War in 2041, and once in the final battle for the Australian mining territories in 2043. The radioactive zones from these conflicts had further reduced the available habitable land, forcing even more population into the overcrowded atmospheric domes and underground cities. By 2045, human civilization had achieved a grim stability. The population had been reduced to sustainable levels, the remaining resources were being carefully managed, and the atmospheric processing systems were successfully maintaining breathable air in the sealed habitation zones. But it had come at the cost of everything that had made human civilization worth preserving. The most disturbing aspect of 2045 wasn't the environmental devastation or the social collapse. It was how normal it had become. The people I encountered weren't living in despair or panic. They had adapted to their reduced world and accepted it as the natural order. Technology had advanced in directions shaped entirely by survival needs. Atmospheric processing, water purification, underground agriculture, and resource recycling had reached incredible levels of sophistication. But space exploration, scientific research, and artistic expression had largely disappeared. The resources needed for non-essential activities were devoted entirely to maintaining the systems that kept humanity alive. I spent hours in what had been the Houston Public Library, now converted into a resource management center, reading historical records of how the world had changed. The transition hadn't been sudden. It had been a gradual descent over 2 decades, with each crisis requiring new restrictions and resource allocations until freedom and exploration became luxuries humanity could no longer afford. On my 3rd day in 2045, while exploring the abandoned NASA facility where I had arrived, I discovered that the quantum drive experiment was still running. The equipment was badly damaged and overgrown with vegetation, but the exotic matter containment system was somehow still maintaining a low-level temporal field. Dr. Jennifer Park, who in my timeline had been our quantum field specialist, had left detailed notes hidden in the facility. Apparently, my disappearance in 2019 had been attributed to a fatal accident, but Jennifer had suspected the truth and had been working for decades to recreate the conditions that might bring me back. Her notes explained that the temporal displacement was unstable and cyclical. Every 72 hours, the field would briefly reconnect with my original timeline, creating a window for return. But the window was closing. The equipment was failing, and this might be the last opportunity. At exactly 14:23 on March 18th, 2045, 72 hours after my arrival, I positioned myself in the center of the temporal field as Jennifer's notes instructed. The same stretching, compressing sensation occurred, and I found myself back in the 2019 laboratory, just moments after the original accident. To everyone else, I had been gone for less than 3 minutes. When I tried to report what I had experienced, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the facility was swarmed with officials from NASA, the Department of Energy, the Pentagon, and agencies I couldn't identify. All evidence of our quantum drive research was classified at levels that made it essentially disappear. The equipment was dismantled and shipped to classified facilities. The research data was seized and locked away in systems I wasn't allowed to access. The official story became that our experiment had failed due to an exotic matter containment breach. The slight time displacement I had experienced was attributed to instrument error and disorientation from electromagnetic exposure. I was transferred to a theoretical research position with no access to experimental facilities and required to sign documents that prohibited me from discussing any aspect of our quantum drive research. But I had brought back more than just memories from 2045. I had photographed historical documents, recorded video on my phone, and collected physical samples that proved I had actually traveled through time. More importantly, I had detailed knowledge of events that would unfold over the next 26 years. And over the past 4 years, I've watched with growing horror as those events have begun happening exactly as I witnessed them. The climate acceleration that began in 2031 started showing early signs in 2021. The political tensions that led to the resource wars began emerging in 2022. The technological developments that enable the atmospheric processing systems are being researched right now by companies that don't yet realize what they're preparing for. Every major event I witnessed in 2045's history has been unfolding on precisely the timeline I observed. Dr. Michael Torres began expressing doubts about the official story of our experiment and started conducting his own research into temporal displacement effects. He died in a car accident in 2020, despite being one of the most cautious drivers I'd ever known. Dr. Jennifer Park, the same woman who had left notes for me in 2045, started questioning why our research had been so completely classified and began reaching out to other physicists about temporal mechanics. She was found dead from an apparent suicide in 2022. Despite having no history of depression and actively working on research she was excited about. Their deaths weren't just personal losses. They eliminated the only other people who might have been able to continue the research needed to prevent the future I had witnessed. I'm breaking my silence because the timeline I witnessed is not inevitable. Time travel paradoxes are complex, but the fact that I was able to return to my original timeline suggests that the future can be changed. The climate catastrophe, the resource wars, the collapse of human civilization, none of this has to happen. But it will happen if we continue on our current path without taking immediate, drastic action to change course. The technology exists right now to prevent the atmospheric cascades that led to the toxic environment of 2045. The political and economic structures could be modified to prevent the resource conflicts that destroyed so much of the world. But the window for action is closing rapidly. By 2030, according to what I witnessed, the cascade effects become irreversible. After that point, humanity's best option will be managed collapse rather than preventing disaster entirely. I've seen humanity's future, and it's not extinction, it's something worse. It's the reduction of our species to mere survival, the abandonment of everything that makes human civilization meaningful. But I've also seen that this future isn't fixed. The timeline can be changed, but only if we act now, and only if we're willing to make the difficult choices that my timeline refused to make. We need to treat climate change not as a long-term policy challenge, but as an immediate existential threat requiring wartime-level mobilization. We need to restructure our economy and society to prioritize sustainability over growth. And we need to begin preparing for the technological and social changes that will be necessary to prevent the collapse I witnessed. My name is Dr. Rebecca Walsh. On March 15, 2019, I accidentally traveled to the year 2045 and witnessed the collapse of human civilization. What I saw doesn't have to happen. But it will happen if we continue to pretend that the future will somehow take care of itself. The quantum drive experiment that sent me to 2045 was shut down and are classified to prevent anyone else from witnessing what I saw. But the future I visited is rushing toward us at the rate of 1 day per day, and we're running out of time to change course. The choice is ours, but we need to make it now while we still can. I've seen the future. Trust me, you don't want to live there.